began in a time when the galaxy looked calm on the surface, but deep inside it was full of pride, power, and quiet fear. And in the center of everything stood the Grand Council, where ancient alien races gathered to decide the fate of stars, while humans, a young and growing species, were treated like small children who had wandered into a room meant for giants. And among those humans was a calm and observant man named June, who often stood at the edge of the council hall beside Mira, a sharp-minded woman who saw more than she spoke, and Day, a quiet strategist who rarely showed emotion, and Era, a thoughtful diplomat who believed that patience was stronger than anger, and together they watched as the great races argued over power, never once asking what humans thought, never once believing humans mattered, because to them humanity was weak, divided, and slow, a species still learning to stand while others had already conquered galaxies. And so humans were given small tasks, minor roles, and empty respect, often asked to observe but never to lead. And yet June did not feel insulted. Instead he watched carefully, listening to every word, studying every move, because he understood something the others did not, that power was not only in strength but in understanding. And while the aliens fought with pride, humans learned with silence. And one day everything changed when news spread like fire through every system that the Emperor, the one ruler who kept balance across the galaxy, had died suddenly without naming an heir. And his death created a silence so heavy that even the stars seemed to dim. Because the Emperor was not just a ruler but a symbol of order, and without him the throne stood empty. A single seat of control that held the power to command fleets, shape laws, and decide the future of countless worlds. And the moment it became vacant, the calm of the galaxy broke apart, and in the council hall the ancient races began to argue louder than ever before, each one claiming they had the right to take the throne, each one believing they were the only true leader, and voices rose, alliances cracked, and threats were spoken openly, while June and his team stood quietly in the background, unnoticed as always, yet watching everything. And Mira leaned slightly toward June and whispered that this was the moment everything would begin to fall apart. And June simply nodded because he could already see it happening. The balance was gone and nothing would stop the chaos now, and across the galaxy fleets began to move, massive warships leaving their stations, gathering near key systems, preparing for what many feared would become a war for the throne, and smaller races, those who had always lived under the protection of stronger empires, began to panic, unsure of who to trust or where to go. And in the middle of all this, humans did something unexpected. They did nothing in public, they made no claim, they raised no voice, and this silence made them seem even weaker to the others, who dismissed them completely, believing humans were too afraid to act. But behind that silence, June and his group were already working, meeting in quiet rooms far from the noise of the council, speaking in calm voices about what needed to be done. And Day showed reports of fleet movements, pointing out patterns that others had missed, and Era spoke about smaller systems that were already losing support, places where fear was growing and order was fading. And Mira explained how the council's divisions would only make things worse. And June listened to all of them before speaking in a steady voice that carried quiet confidence, saying that humans would not fight for the throne like the others, because that was exactly what everyone expected. Instead they would prepare, they would watch, and when the time came, they would act in a way no one would see coming. And so while the great races prepared for war, humanity began to move in the shadows, sending small fleets not to conquer but to observe and assist, helping stabilize trade routes that had begun to fail, protecting civilian ships from pirates who were taking advantage of the chaos, and offering quiet support to systems that had been abandoned by their rulers. And slowly, without drawing attention, humans began to build trust, not through power but through action. And in one distant system, a group of traders found themselves under attack, expecting no help, until a small human fleet arrived and drove the attackers away with surprising skill. And the traders spread the story, speaking of humans not as weak beings but as protectors. And in another system where two minor races were on the edge of war, a human diplomat named Era arrived and spoke with both sides, calming their anger and finding a solution that avoided bloodshed. And again the story spread, quiet at first but growing with each telling. And back in the council hall the great races were too busy arguing to notice these small changes, too focused on their own ambitions to see that something new was rising. And June returned to the hall one day with Mira by his side, standing once again in the place where humans were usually ignored. But this time his eyes were different, calm but filled with purpose, and Mira asked him softly if he believed they were ready. And June looked at the empty throne in the distance, the symbol of everything the galaxy was fighting over, and he answered that readiness was not about strength but about timing, and their time was coming, because while the galaxy saw humans as weak, humanity had been learning, growing, and preparing in silence, and now as the throne remained empty and the great powers moved closer to war, the one thing no one realized was that the species they had ignored was already changing the galaxy in ways they could not yet see, and far beyond the bright lights of the Council, human ships moved like quiet shadows between the stars, carrying with them not just technology and skill, but a new idea of power, one built on unity, patience, and understanding. And as fear slowly spread among the systems and the old rulers tightened their grip in desperation, the first true step of humanity's rise had already begun, unnoticed, underestimated, and unstoppable. The galaxy did not fall into chaos all at once, but rather slowly, like a great machine losing its balance gear by gear, and after the Emperor's death and the discovery that no heir had been chosen, the empty throne became the center of every thought, every fear, and every ambition. And in the Grand Council Hall the once careful debates turned into loud arguments filled with anger and suspicion, as the ancient races who had once pretended to respect each other now openly accused one another of planning betrayal, and among them sat human observers like June, Mira, Day, and Era, still quiet, still ignored, but now watching a galaxy that was starting to tear itself apart, while across the hall species like the Varnox and the Selkari pushed forward their claims to rule, each presenting ancient rights, old treaties, and forgotten bloodlines as proof that the throne should belong to them, and yet none of them could agree, and every meeting ended with louder shouting than before, and outside the council systems began to shift as fleets moved without permission. Borders became uncertain, and trade routes that once connected thousands of worlds started to break apart, causing panic in smaller systems that depended on stability. And in one such system a young human officer named Hyan reported to June that supply ships had stopped arriving, and that famine could begin within weeks if nothing was done. And June listened carefully but did not show panic. Instead he simply asked for more data, because he understood that panic was the first step toward losing control, while Mira worked with encrypted communications trying to map the movement of alien fleets that were now gathering near strategic choke points, and Day quietly analyzed patterns in the chaos, noticing that the larger empires were not acting as unified powers but as fractured groups within themselves, each commander making personal decisions rather than following central command. And Era moved between diplomatic channels that were slowly breaking down, trying to maintain contact with minor systems that were now afraid of being abandoned completely. And as the situation worsened, the Council attempted to enforce order by sending official messages demanding all fleets return to their positions, but those messages were ignored or challenged, because without the Emperor there was no fear strong enough to hold the galaxy together, and so the throne, once a symbol of absolute control, became a symbol of weakness, and this realization spread like poison through the minds of ambitious leaders, and in secret meetings held across different systems, new alliances began forming not based on loyalty or history but on opportunity, and some of these alliances were meant to seize the throne by force, while others were meant to destroy it entirely so no one could claim it. And through all of this humans remained outwardly silent, still seen as observers, still dismissed as unimportant. But behind closed doors something very different was happening, because June had begun coordinating a network of small human-led missions that were not part of any official council record, and these missions were simple in purpose but powerful in effect, as they focused on stabilizing chaos instead of controlling it. And in one region where pirate fleets had begun attacking helpless trade convoys, a human escort group led by Captain Sun quietly eliminated the threat not by overwhelming force but by precise strikes that avoided civilian damage, and the survivors began to spread stories of human efficiency and restraint. While in another region Era met with two minor alien governments on the edge of war and prevented conflict by showing them intercepted data that revealed both sides had been manipulated by outside factions, and this prevented a local war that would have destroyed entire colonies. And news of these events slowly began to spread beyond the affected systems. But still the larger empires did not take it seriously, because in their minds humans were still too new, too weak, and too divided to matter in galactic politics. Yet Mira noticed something important, that every time humans acted, stability returned to that region faster than anywhere else, and she shared this observation with June, who simply replied that stability was not something given by power alone, but something earned through trust and consistency. And meanwhile the council itself became even more unstable as factions openly discussed removing the idea of a shared throne, and replacing it with divided rule, while others argued that only total domination could restore order. And these debates often ended in fleet movements rather than words. And Day warned that if even one major empire made a full aggressive move, it could trigger a galaxy-wide war within days. And this warning proved true when a large cell-carry fleet entered disputed territory claiming it was securing order, which was immediately interpreted by other factions as an act of invasion, and within hours counterfleets were deployed, and the fragile peace shattered even further. And in the middle of this escalation, June received a message from Era that several minor systems were now requesting direct human protection. Not from the Council, but from humanity itself, and this was the first time such a request had ever been made, and it changed something in June's thinking, because it showed that while the great powers fought for control, smaller systems were already choosing stability over tradition, and so he called a quiet meeting with his team, including Mira, Day, Era, Hyan, and a few trusted officers, and he explained that humanity was no longer just an observer because whether they wanted it or not, they were becoming a reference point for order in a collapsing galaxy, and he said that they would not declare war, and they would not claim authority yet, but they would expand their protective network carefully, making sure that every action they took strengthened trust rather than fear, and Mira asked if the Council would allow this, and June answered honestly that the Council was no longer capable of allowing or stopping anything, because it was already breaking apart from inside, and so human ships increased their quiet movements, entering systems under the excuse of humanitarian aid, escort missions, and emergency stabilization, and each successful mission added another layer of trust among the smaller species, while fear began to grow among the larger empires who started to notice that wherever humans appeared, chaos seemed to settle faster than expected, and rumors began to spread in council corridors that humanity was not as passive as it seemed, and that perhaps they were building something larger in the background, but still no one acted directly against them, because each empire was too focused on the throne and on their own survival to fully understand the shift happening beneath them. And in this growing instability, the empty throne remained untouched in the council hall, a silent reminder of a broken order, while outside it the galaxy slowly changed hands not through conquest or declaration, but through quiet actions, careful decisions, and the steady rise of a species that had once been ignored but was now becoming impossible to overlook. The galaxy had now entered a dangerous stage where silence was no longer peace but preparation for war, and every system could feel the pressure building like a storm that had not yet broken but was already destroying everything inside it. While the empty throne in the Grand Council Hall stood untouched like a wound in the center of civilization, and the council itself had stopped functioning as a true governing body, becoming instead a place of shouting factions, broken alliances, and secret threats, where ancient races like the Varnox, Selkari, and Orthene no longer hid their intentions and openly prepared fleets for possible takeover, and among all this chaos humanity continued its quiet rise, still officially seen as observers but now quietly becoming something far more important, and June, Mira, Day, Era, and Hyan worked together in a hidden command network deep inside a human-controlled research station orbiting a neutral system, where they monitored the collapse of galactic order in real time, and June studied reports showing how entire trade routes had disappeared due to piracy and war, how colonies were being abandoned, and how smaller species were begging for protection from anyone willing to listen, and Mira observed that fear had become the dominant force in the galaxy, replacing respect and law, while Day mapped fleet movements showing that multiple empires were now positioning themselves not just for the throne but for survival against each other, and Era continued her diplomatic work, now receiving direct requests from minor systems asking humanity to intervene before they were destroyed, and Hyan coordinated human patrol fleets that were quietly expanding their presence under humanitarian missions, and what made humanity different was not just their technology but their behavior, because while others acted for control or domination, humans acted for stability and survival of others, and this difference began to change how smaller civilizations saw them, and in one case a cluster of agricultural worlds under threat from pirate raids formally requested human protection, bypassing the council entirely, and this was the first time a group had chosen humanity over the established galactic authority. And when June reviewed this request, he did not celebrate. Instead, he analyzed what it meant for long-term balance, because he understood that trust could become responsibility very quickly. And meanwhile, in the council hall, tensions exploded further when the Selkari faction declared control over a key navigation sector, claiming it was necessary to restore order. But this action was seen by others as an invasion, and within hours rival fleets moved into position, and the fragile balance collapsed into open conflict in multiple border regions. And as war slowly spread across the stars, Mira reported that communication between major empires was breaking down completely, with some systems now refusing all external contact, and Day warned that if 3 more major conflicts broke out at once, the entire council structure would become irrelevant within weeks. And Era added that several minor races had already started forming evacuation plans, fearing they would be caught between the fighting giants, and in response June made a decision that changed humanity's position forever, not by declaring war or claiming the throne, but by expanding their protection network beyond hidden operations into a structured system called the Human Stabilization Grid, which connected fleets, communication relays, and rescue operations across multiple sectors. And this system was designed not to conquer but to respond, not to rule but to stabilize, and at first it operated quietly, with human ships entering conflict zones only when civilian survival was at risk. And in one such incident, a human commander named Captain Yoon led a rescue operation in a contested system where 2 alien fleets had begun a battle that was destroying nearby colonies, and instead of engaging both sides directly, Yoon focused on evacuation corridors, shielding civilian transports, and disabling weapon platforms that threatened populated areas. And this action saved thousands of lives but also drew attention from both empires involved, who could not understand why humans would interfere without claiming territory or demanding compensation. And this confusion began to spread across military channels, because human behavior did not match any known political model in the galaxy. And meanwhile Era continued receiving messages from smaller systems, one of which came from a coalition of mining colonies led by a young representative named Lyra, who asked for permanent human presence because council protection had become unreliable. And when this message was reviewed in the Human Command Center, it sparked a serious debate, because accepting such responsibility meant becoming a central pillar of galactic stability whether humanity wanted it or not. And Mira argued that refusal would lead to mass suffering in unprotected regions, while Day warned that accepting too quickly could provoke direct confrontation with major empires, and June listened to both sides carefully, before concluding that humanity could not avoid its role any longer, because the galaxy was already assigning it that role through its actions, and so the stabilization grid was expanded further, with human fleets now openly stationed in select systems under emergency protection agreements. And this shift immediately changed political dynamics, because for the first time the great empires saw humanity not as a background observer but as an active stabilizing force that was gaining influence without conquest, and this created fear among the council factions, especially those who relied on chaos to expand their own power, and secret discussions began about how to limit human expansion. But no unified action could be agreed upon because the council itself was now too fractured. And in the middle of this rising tension, a major event occurred when a disputed core system known as Helion Reach became the center of a 3-way conflict between Selkari, Varnox, and Orthene fleets, and what was expected to become a short territorial takeover turned into a massive battle that threatened to destroy the entire system. And in response, humanity activated full stabilization protocols for the first time, sending multiple fleets under coordinated command led by June, Mira, Day, Era, and Hyen. And instead of choosing sides, the human forces entered the system with one objective only: stop destruction of civilian life. And as the battle intensified, human ships moved between firing lines, deploying advanced interference fields that disrupted targeting systems near populated zones, while evacuation teams rescued entire populations from orbital colonies under fire, and Captain Yoon coordinated with Era to guide civilian transports through safe corridors, and Day synchronized fleet movements to minimize exposure to crossfire, and Mira maintained constant communication between scattered human units while also intercepting council transmissions that revealed confusion and panic among the warring empires, because none of them had expected a neutral force to enter such a high-level conflict without political demands. And June observed everything from the command center, noting that for the first time in this war the destruction rate had slowed significantly, and in some areas had stopped completely, not because one side had won, but because a third force had removed the cost of continued fighting. And this realization began to spread among lower-ranking commanders of all factions, who started to question whether the war itself made sense if another group could preserve life without demanding control. And as the Helion Reach conflict slowly stabilized, the reputation of humanity changed permanently, because they were no longer seen as passive observers or weak participants, but as active protectors who operated outside traditional power structures. And while the council continued to argue over the empty throne, a new truth began forming across the galaxy. That real influence was no longer held only by those who claimed authority, but by those who could maintain order when authority itself had failed. And in that growing shift, humanity's position strengthened quietly, steadily, and irreversibly, as more systems began requesting stabilization grid presence, and more fleets began recognizing human intervention not as intrusion but as survival. And deep within the council hall, the empty throne remained untouched. But now it no longer represented opportunity alone, because increasingly it represented irrelevance in a galaxy where a new kind of power was rising, one built not on fear or conquest, but on trust earned in the middle of collapse. The galaxy had now reached a point where fear was no longer a reaction but a constant state of existence, as the great empires that once controlled vast regions of space now found themselves trapped in endless conflict, and the Grand Council, which had once been the center of order, had become little more than a broken hall of arguments surrounding an empty throne that no one could agree on but everyone desired. While across the stars the human stabilization grid had expanded into a structured network of protection zones, rescue fleets, and communication relays that quietly connected hundreds of systems. And within this growing structure, June, Mira, Day, Era, and Hyan worked tirelessly from a central command station hidden in a neutral star system, where every screen showed collapsing borders, rising casualties, and shifting alliances, and June studied each report with calm focus, noticing that the galaxy was no longer divided into simple empires but into zones of survival and zones of destruction. While Mira managed intelligence streams that showed increasing hostility from major factions toward any system that accepted human protection, and Day tracked fleet movements that revealed something more dangerous than war itself, which was coordination attempts between previously rival empires to counter the growing influence of humanity. And Era continued receiving messages from smaller civilizations now fully dependent on human stabilization, including a system of research colonies led by a young diplomat named Nari, who expressed gratitude but also fear that humanity would eventually be forced into direct war with the Council powers, and Hyan organized emergency response fleets that now operated openly in dozens of regions, often arriving faster than any Council military force. And as human influence grew, so did suspicion, especially among the Varnox, Selkari, and Orthene factions, who began to see humanity not as neutral protectors but as a rising power that disrupted their control over chaos. And in council chambers debates turned darker, with some leaders openly stating that humanity must be restricted before it replaced the existing order, while others argued that humans were the only reason some systems had not already collapsed completely, and this division prevented any unified action, making the council weaker with every passing cycle. And in response, several major empires began forming what they called the Restoration Pact, a coalition meant to reclaim control over stabilizing systems and reduce human influence, but in reality it was a fragile alliance built on fear rather than trust. And June analyzed this development carefully, understanding that once fear became the foundation of alliances, collapse always followed. And meanwhile the stabilization grid faced its first coordinated resistance, when multiple factions began interfering with human operations in contested regions, attempting to block supply routes, jam communications, and discredit human rescue missions by spreading false reports that humanity was manipulating conflicts for hidden control. And in one system known as Viral Prime, a major incident occurred when a council-aligned fleet entered a human-protected zone claiming jurisdiction over emergency operations, resulting in a standoff that threatened to escalate into open conflict. And Mira monitored the situation closely while Day prepared defensive protocols. But June ordered restraint, insisting that humanity must not become the trigger for galactic war, and instead Era attempted direct communication with the opposing commander, a rigid Selkari officer named Karan, who believed that human presence in the system was illegal under ancient council law. But Era calmly presented data showing that without human intervention, the system's population would have already been lost to ongoing raids and internal collapse, and Karan hesitated for the first time when confronted not by force but by undeniable results. And this hesitation allowed time for a temporary agreement, but the incident spread rapidly through council networks, becoming a symbol of growing tension between old authority and new stability. And as pressure increased, the Restoration Pact accelerated its efforts, deploying propaganda fleets that broadcast messages across neutral systems warning that humanity was secretly preparing to seize control of the throne. And these messages began to create uncertainty even among smaller civilizations that had previously trusted humans, An era reported that some allied systems were beginning to request confirmation of human intentions, fearing they were being drawn into a larger conflict, and this was the first time doubt had entered the stabilization grid, and June understood that trust, once shaken, could collapse faster than it was built. So he called a full coordination meeting where all human regional commanders, including Captain Yoon, Captain Sarah, and Officer Hwan, joined to assess the situation, and Mira presented intelligence showing that Restoration-packed fleets were now positioning near multiple human-protected zones, likely preparing for simultaneous pressure attacks, and Day warned that if even one protected system fell due to human withdrawal, the entire network's credibility would weaken significantly. And Era added that several minor civilizations were now asking whether humanity could guarantee long-term safety or only temporary relief. And in this moment June made a decision that shifted humanity's role once again, because instead of retreating or escalating into war, he authorized the formal declaration of the stabilization doctrine, a policy stating that human forces would intervene in any system where civilian survival was threatened regardless of council approval, but would never claim ownership, territory, or political control, and this declaration spread across the galaxy faster than any military action, because it was simple, direct, and unlike anything the ancient empires had ever offered, and reactions were immediate, with Restoration-packed leaders condemning it as illegal interference, while smaller systems celebrated it as the first true guarantee of survival they had ever received. And soon after, a coordinated attempt was made to test humanity's resolve when 3 simultaneous crises were triggered in different systems under stabilization grid protection, including a pirate invasion, a political uprising, and a targeted infrastructure collapse caused by sabotage, and human fleets responded across all 3 locations at once, led by coordinated teams under June's command with Mira handling intersystem communication, Day optimizing fleet distribution, Era coordinating diplomatic de-escalation efforts, and Hyan managing evacuation logistics, while Captain Yoon and Captain Sarah led direct field operations, and in each case human forces focused not on defeating enemies but on preventing total collapse. And this approach once again revealed a pattern that many had begun to notice, which was that humanity did not behave like a conquering power but like a system designed to prevent failure, and even opposing commanders began to question whether resisting such a force made sense when it was not seeking control. And during the crisis in the Helix Corridor, a key trade region, human ships physically placed themselves between opposing fleets and civilian habitats, absorbing communication disruption efforts and guiding evacuation convoys through safe routes. And although this caused frustration among Council-aligned commanders, it also prevented what would have been a total system-wide disaster, and as the crisis ended, reports spread across the galaxy showing that in all 3 simultaneous incidents, civilian survival rates under human intervention were significantly higher than in any council-managed response in recent cycles, and this data could not be easily dismissed, even by those who opposed humanity, and in the aftermath, the Restoration Pact faced internal disagreements as some member factions began quietly questioning whether opposing humanity was truly in their interest, while others pushed harder for confrontation, believing that human influence would eventually erase their authority completely. And within the stabilization grid itself, June observed a growing transformation, because humanity was no longer simply responding to crises but shaping the expectations of entire civilizations, and Mira noted that fear of collapse was slowly being replaced by trust in human intervention, while Day warned that this also meant humanity was becoming the default responsibility for galactic stability, whether they accepted it or not. And Era reflected that even the empty throne in the council hall was no longer the central question of the galaxy, because more and more systems were choosing safety over authority, and as human fleets continued their silent operations across contested space, the galaxy entered a new and unstable phase where old power still existed but no longer fully controlled outcomes, and in this shifting balance, humanity stood not as rulers or rebels, but as the unavoidable center of survival in a collapsing order that could no longer function without them. And deep in the council hall the empty throne remained untouched, but its meaning had changed, because now it was not just a prize waiting to be claimed, but a symbol of an era that was slowly ending under the quiet rise of a species that refused to conquer, yet could no longer be ignored. The galaxy had now reached its final breaking point, where the old order no longer held real power but still refused to disappear, and the Grand Council, once the center of unity and law, had become a hollow structure filled with fear, divided voices, and fading authority, while the empty throne at its center remained untouched yet more powerful in meaning than ever before. because it now symbolized not control but loss of control, and across thousands of systems, the human stabilization grid had grown into the only functioning structure capable of maintaining large-scale order, with fleets, communication networks, and evacuation systems operating continuously under the leadership of June, Mira, Day, Era, and Hyen, and from their central command station they watched the final transformation of the galaxy unfold, as major empires like the Varnox, Selkari, and Orthene could no longer hide their internal collapse, with factions breaking apart, commanders refusing orders, and entire fleets acting independently based on survival rather than loyalty, and Mira reported that council transmissions were now fragmented and often contradictory, showing that no single authority could control even their own systems anymore, while Day analyzed the final structure of the Restoration Pact and confirmed that it had failed to unify its members, instead turning into a loose group of fearful powers each trying to preserve their own influence, and Era continued receiving increasing numbers of requests from once independent civilizations, including systems led by representatives like Lyra, Nari, and Hyogen, who no longer asked for temporary aid but for permanent integration into human protection zones, and Hyen coordinated emergency logistics on a scale never seen before, moving entire populations between systems as wars, collapses, and internal rebellions spread faster than any council response could handle. And in this environment humanity was no longer questioned as a helper, but treated as the only stable force left, although this position came with growing tension, because the more humanity stabilized, the more it was blamed by collapsing powers for destroying the old balance, and June understood that the galaxy was approaching a moment where neutrality would no longer be possible, because either humanity would be forced into leadership, or it would be forced into war against every failing power at once. And this realization became clear during the crisis of the Orion Divide, where multiple major fleets from different factions converged in a massive confrontation that threatened to ignite a chain reaction across nearby systems, and at the same time several protected systems under the stabilization grid were targeted by coordinated attacks meant to overwhelm human response capacity. And Mira immediately detected the pattern and confirmed it was a deliberate attempt to test whether humanity could be stretched beyond its limits. And Day warned that if even one protected system failed catastrophically, the entire network's credibility would collapse, while Era noted that smaller civilizations were already preparing evacuation requests in anticipation of possible human withdrawal, and in that critical moment June made the most important decision humanity had ever faced, ordering the full activation of the Global Stabilization Protocol, which converted the human stabilization grid from a reactive network into a unified emergency governance system across all active zones, and this meant that for the first time human coordination was no longer hidden or partial but fully structured across entire sectors, and Captain Yoon, Captain Sarah, and Commander Huan led synchronized fleet operations across multiple systems simultaneously, while Mira managed real-time interstellar communication that linked hundreds of emergency zones into a single operational field, and Day coordinated fleet distribution with mathematical precision to ensure no system was left undefended, and Era handled diplomatic communication with both allied and neutral systems, explaining that humanity's intervention was not conquest but containment of collapse, and Hyen managed mass evacuation efforts that moved billions of lives away from conflict zones. And as this operation unfolded the galaxy witnessed something unprecedented, because instead of escalating into total war, several simultaneous conflicts began to stabilize as human fleets entered contested zones and enforced separation of combat forces while prioritizing civilian survival above all else. And in one of the largest battles near the Helion Rift, opposing fleets from 3 major empires, including a Selkari War Armada, a Varnox Strike Coalition, and Orthene defense groups, found themselves unable to continue their engagement as human ships positioned themselves between firing lines, using non-lethal disruption fields and precise navigation interference to prevent further escalation. And although this frustrated military commanders who were trained to view interference as hostility, it also forced a pause in destruction long enough for evacuation and diplomatic contact to begin. And during this pause Era directly communicated with multiple fleet leaders, presenting them with verified data showing that continued engagement would lead to total regional collapse within hours, and this information, combined with visible human stabilization efforts already saving countless civilian lives, began to create hesitation even among hardened commanders, and Mira observed that this hesitation was spreading faster than expected, as communication channels between opposing fleets started to shift from aggression to uncertainty, and Day confirmed that in multiple regions, Ceasefire conditions were forming not through agreement but through exhaustion and recognition that further conflict was pointless under human intervention, and as the global stabilization protocol continued, June monitored the broader pattern and realized that humanity was no longer simply preventing disasters but actively changing how war itself functioned in real time, because traditional galactic warfare depended on total control of escalation, but human intervention removed that control by ensuring that civilian survival was always prioritized, making full-scale destruction increasingly ineffective as a political tool, and this shift caused deep unrest among Council remnants and Restoration Pact leaders, who now openly debated whether humanity represented the end of their authority altogether, and some factions began preparing what they called the Final Resistance Directive, a plan to force humanity into either submission or open conflict, but internal disagreements weakened this plan before it could fully form, because many leaders feared that direct war with humanity would only accelerate their own collapse, and meanwhile within the stabilization grid, trust among smaller civilizations continued to grow rapidly, as entire systems began requesting permanent integration into human protection zones, effectively transferring responsibility for their survival to humanity without formal political submission. An era noted that this was creating a new type of galactic structure that no longer resembled empire or council rule but something closer to shared dependency on stability providers, and Mira warned that such dependency could eventually become expectation, and expectation could become obligation, and obligation could become leadership whether humanity wanted it or not. And June acknowledged this quietly, understanding that the galaxy was already deciding humanity's role regardless of their intentions, and in the final phase of the Orion Divide crisis, as opposing fleets withdrew under pressure and civilian evacuations were completed successfully, data from all regions confirmed a dramatic reduction in total casualties compared to any previous council-managed conflict, and this result spread instantly across all remaining networks, creating a shift in perception that could no longer be reversed, because even the most resistant factions had to acknowledge that human intervention consistently produced survival outcomes where traditional systems produced destruction. And as the crisis ended and fleets returned to unstable borders, the galaxy entered a new phase where the empty throne in the council hall no longer represented the center of power, because real influence had moved elsewhere, into the hands of a species that had not claimed authority but had earned necessity. And as June, Mira, Day, Era, and Hyan reviewed the final reports from the stabilization protocol activation, they all understood the same truth without needing to say it aloud: that humanity was no longer outside the galaxy's power structure but had become the structure itself, not through conquest, but through the simple, irreversible fact that when everything else failed, they were the ones who kept the stars from falling into silence.